President Donald Trump signed orders on Saturday to impose sweeping tariffs on imports from Canada, Mexico, and China, escalating a trade war that threatens to reshape global supply chains and rattle financial markets. The measure includes a 25% tariff on most goods entering from Canada and Mexico, as well as a 10% tariff on Chinese products. Trump has long argued that these levies are necessary to address trade imbalances and the flow of undocumented migrants and illegal drugs. The immediate backlash from some of the nation's largest trading partners, coupled with warnings from economists, underscores the risks for American consumers, companies, and the broader U.S. economy. Before addressing Trump's warning to Canada in response to Canada's retaliation, let's first examine the measures taken by the Canadian government and provinces against the U.S. tariffs. The White House's tariff orders take effect at 12:01 a.m. on Tuesday, giving little time for last-minute negotiations. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau swiftly announced reciprocal 25% tariffs on roughly 155 billion Canadian dollars, 106 billion US dollars of U.S. goods. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum also pledged corresponding countermeasures, but did not immediately release a detailed list. Meanwhile, China's Commerce Ministry vowed legal proceedings at the World Trade Organization and signaled it would respond in kind, though as of Sunday it had not specified new tariffs. Trudeau, invoking Canada's long history of security and military cooperation with the U.S., condemned the move and urged Canadians to support local products and reconsider travel to American destinations. Mexican officials, meanwhile, rejected the Trump administration's assertion that Mexico has not done enough to prevent illicit drug flows, pointing instead to the importance of bilateral cooperation in addressing the fentanyl crisis. Both countries warned that if the tariffs persist for several months, their economies could face significant disruptions, risks mirrored in the U.S. as well. In addition to the federal government's plans, Canadian provinces are also implementing additional measures. Ontario, Canada's most populous province and an economic powerhouse, has been particularly vocal in its response. Premier Doug Ford instructed the Liquor Control Board of Ontario to immediately remove American-made alcoholic beverages from its shelves. This move is symbolic as well as economically impactful, given that Ontario imports nearly $1 billion worth of American wine, beer, spirits, and shelter annually. Ford has also hinted at further actions against U.S. businesses operating in Ontario, potentially affecting trade agreements related to automobiles and technology. The provincial government is working closely with Canadian retailers and manufacturers to redirect supply chains toward domestic and European suppliers. Furthermore, Ford has called for a snap provincial election on February 27th, arguing that Ontario needs a stronger mandate to effectively respond to U.S. economic aggression. British Columbia, known for its progressive policies, has taken a direct and politically charged approach. Premier David Eby announced that the BC Liquor Distribution Branch will immediately halt purchases of liquor from Republican-led U.S. states, a policy particularly aimed at states that have supported Trump's tariff policies. Additionally, British Columbia is exploring increased taxation on American tech and entertainment services, including streaming platforms, to encourage local alternatives. The province has also emphasized boosting local agricultural and seafood exports to Asian markets as a counterbalance to any economic strain caused by reduced U.S. trade. Nova Scotia has taken a multifaceted approach to retaliation, focusing on infrastructure and commercial accessibility. Premier Tim Houston stated that the province will double highway tolls for U.S. commercial vehicles, a measure aimed at discouraging American truckers from using Nova Scotia as a trade route. Additionally, the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation will cease sales of all U.S. alcoholic beverages by February 4th, further reinforcing the nationwide move to limit American imports. These measures are expected to generate additional provincial revenue while increasing costs for U.S. businesses transporting goods through the region. Quebec's economic defense strategy involves a more systemic approach by reviewing all procurement contracts involving American suppliers with the intention of penalizing those that maintain ties to U.S. government policies. Premier François Legault has indicated that Quebec may prioritize European and Asian suppliers in key sectors, including pharmaceuticals and construction. The provincial government has also launched an economic support package for local industries that might be affected by U.S. tariffs, providing subsidies to companies willing to shift away from American raw materials. In Canada's northern region, the Northwest Territories are pushing for self-sufficiency. The government of the Northwest Territories has announced plans to review procurement policies to eliminate purchases from U.S. companies where possible. This move aligns with broader federal efforts to promote Canadian self-sufficiency, particularly in resource-dependent regions. Premier R.J. Simpson emphasized that economic resilience is crucial for remote areas that often rely on American goods for essential supplies. The territory is also looking into strengthening trade ties with Indigenous businesses and Arctic nations to further diversify its economic network. These provincial measures complement the federal government's broader plan to impose 25% tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods, set to take effect on February 4, 2025. The initial phase, covering $30 billion in imports, targets consumer products such as beverages, cosmetics, and paper goods. While provinces have taken independent actions tailored to their economic needs, they remain aligned with Ottawa's overarching strategy to pressure Washington into reconsidering its trade policies. This unfolding trade war is reshaping Canada's domestic and international economic policies with long-term consequences for industries and consumers on both sides of the border. With provinces implementing varied strategies, from direct product bans to infrastructure-related costs, the overall impact on U.S. Canada trade relations remains uncertain, but is likely to be profound. In two controversial social media posts published a few hours after Canada's retaliation, President Trump aggressively criticized Canada's trade practices and revived the long-standing, widely dismissed notion of incorporating Canada as the 51st U.S. state. These remarks come amid intensifying trade disputes between Washington and Ottawa, further aggravated by a new round of tariffs on North American imports. The proposals have provoked sharp condemnation from Canadian leaders, who view the statement as a provocative threat rather than a legitimate policy. Trump stated, "Without this massive subsidy, Canada ceases to exist as a viable country." Harsh but true. Therefore, Canada should become our cherished 51st state. Much lower taxes, far better military protection for the people of Canada, and no tariffs. In a separate post, he claimed that the United States pays hundreds of billions of dollars to subsidize Canada, suggesting that Washington receives little in return. He went on to assert that the U.S. possesses unlimited energy, could build its own cars, and has no real need for Canadian lumber, a sector that has been a source of ongoing trade disputes. Concluding that Canada would cease to exist without American subsidies, Trump portrayed statehood as a beneficial path for Canadians, promising lower taxes, robust military defense, and no tariffs. The rhetoric struck a nerve across Canadian political circles. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau swiftly rejected the idea, calling it unfounded, inflammatory, and disrespectful to the long-standing alliance between the two nations. The Canadian public has also been widely critical, with many commentators framing Trump's remarks as a show of brinkmanship aimed at extracting trade concessions. The orders include a clause that allows the United States to increase its tariffs if these countries respond with their own tariffs or other retaliatory measures. The inclusion of this clause indicates the administration's intent to discourage such actions and prevent an escalation of trade tensions. However, the retaliatory tariffs announced by Canada and Mexico suggest that these nations are prepared to defend their economic interests, potentially leading to a further escalation of the trade conflict. Economists warn that these escalating trade tensions could lead to higher consumer prices, disrupted supply chains, and potential economic slowdowns in the involved countries. The situation remains fluid, with the possibility of further retaliatory measures contributing to an intensifying trade conflict. In a follow-up post, Trump blasted what he termed the tariff lobby, implicating the Wall Street Journal and other globalist entities in a campaign to protect countries such as Canada, Mexico, and China. Reiterating his position, the president accused these nations of ripping off the United States for decades through unfavorable trade deficits, lack of crime prevention, and unchecked flows of dangerous drugs, urging manufacturers to move production to the U.S. to avoid tariffs. Trump invoked a vision of an American golden age, conceding that some short-term pain might be necessary to achieve lasting economic gains. Both statements align with Trump's newly signed executive orders, imposing a 25% tariff on most goods from Canada and Mexico and a 10% tariff on Chinese imports, a move that triggered immediate countermeasures from all three nations and further inflamed tensions. Yet, the president's social media commentary on effectively annexing Canada as a cherished 51st state is being met with particular alarm in Ottawa. Taking a quick pause, if you've enjoyed the video so far, please hit the like button to help reach a broader audience. Sharing your thoughts or feedback in the comments makes an even bigger impact. Thank you for watching. In a renewed push of political theater, references to making Canada the 51st state have surfaced humorously in pop culture for decades, yet it is rare to see the concept floated seriously by a sitting U.S. president. Critics call it political theater that plays well with a certain domestic audience, but carries no real legal or diplomatic plausibility. Even so, recent escalations, both in tariff policies and in combative rhetoric, have made the suggestion more worrisome than ever before. Legal experts note that any annexation effort would require extraordinary and nearly impossible steps, including a constitutional amendment or a significant redefinition of international law. Canadian leaders stress that their nation's sovereignty is non-negotiable. In his response, Prime Minister Trudeau stated, "Canadians have fought and worked alongside Americans for centuries, but we remain an independent, sovereign country, and that will not change." Behind the inflammatory social media posts lies a high-stakes trade battle fueled by competing economic visions. Trump's tariffs are intended to pressure countries the White House deems rife with unfair practices. Canada, a country whose borders touch on energy, lumber, and automotive parts, has historically enjoyed close economic ties with its southern neighbor. Yet the White House argues that these ties disproportionately benefit Ottawa. The new tariffs are also affecting U.S. manufacturers, ERS, and farmers who rely on Canadian materials or foreign markets for their exports. Sectors hit especially hard by retaliatory duties could see higher consumer prices, reduced spending, and dampened cross-border investment, ultimately weighing on both American and Canadian GDP growth. Diplomatic fallout and next steps remain uncertain. Washington's hints of annexation, even if not intended as literal policy, risk further alienating an ally considered vital for U.S. supply chains and security cooperation. Meanwhile, Canada is preparing a suite of diplomatic and legal responses aimed at safeguarding its economic interests and shoring up international support, particularly through the World Trade Organization and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Observers warn that continued public skirmishes could undermine long-standing cooperation on issues ranging from defense to environmental protection. Regional experts suggest that if relations deteriorate, collaboration on border security, joint environmental management, including the Great Lakes, and North American aerospace defense could suffer. Despite the incendiary tone, some believe cooler heads may yet prevail behind the scenes as officials in Washington and Ottawa pursue back-channel negotiations to de-escalate tensions. Still, the ongoing stalemate leaves many unanswered questions about the North American trade landscape and whether Trump's call for a 51st state is intended to force a quick resolution or simply inflame public sentiment. Legally, Trump is employing the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1970s-era law that grants the president broad tariff authority in the context of national emergencies. He previously threatened to invoke this statute against Mexico in 2019, but refrained after reaching a negotiation on migration controls. Now, citing a threat to the safety and security of Americans, the president is using the same legal basis to impose tariffs on 3 of the United States' largest trading partners. White House officials say the measures fulfill Trump's campaign promises and address what he views as the chronic subsidization of other nations. The new executive orders, however, go well beyond the metals tariffs seen during his first term from 2017 to 2021, when the administration targeted steel and aluminum. This time, whole swaths of consumer goods, agricultural products, and industrial inputs will face higher border taxes. The immediate market reaction has been one of caution, with analysts warning of far-reaching consequences. Bloomberg Economics estimates that the tariffs will raise the average U.S. tariff rate from near 3% to roughly 10.7%, dealing a significant supply shock to the domestic economy. Analysts project a 1.2% hit to U.S. gross domestic product and a 0.7% increase in a closely watched measure of core inflation, underscoring the broad ramifications. During Trump's first term, when tariffs on steel, aluminum, and certain Chinese goods were introduced, some U.S. manufacturers and farmers experienced sharp cost increases and lost market share as countries responded with retaliatory levies. Similar patterns are expected this time. Higher consumer prices as intermediate goods like auto parts, machinery, and electronics become subject to significant tariffs. U.S. producers will either absorb the cost, hurting their profit margins, or pass it on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Retailers dependent on global supply chains warn that everything from household appliances to apparel could become more expensive. Other concerns include supply chain disruptions, particularly in North American manufacturing, where the auto sector relies on tightly integrated cross-border production networks. Automakers such as General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have already sounded alarms about the financial impact of tariffs on components from Mexico and Canada, while also bracing for retaliatory obstacles to their exports. U.S. farmers, many of whom were hit during the first wave of trade disputes, fear an encore of retaliatory measures on staple exports like soybeans, pork, and dairy. In 2018 and 2019, China, Canada, and Mexico targeted agricultural products in response to steel and aluminum tariffs, causing farm incomes to drop significantly and prompting the White House to offer billions in emergency aid. Rising inflation and interest rates pose yet another risk. Should tariffs persist, the Federal Reserve may face pressure to raise interest rates more aggressively if inflation heats up, potentially slowing investment and dampening consumer spending, at a time when the U.S. economy is still grappling with elevated government debt and uneven job growth. Energy imports from Canada, spanning oil, gas, electric, and critical minerals, will face a reduced 10% tariff rather than the full 25%, an acknowledgement of the deep reliance parts of the U.S. have on Canadian power. Administration officials say this carve-out is intended to mitigate large spikes in fuel costs for American consumers. However, oil industry advocates warn that even a 10% tariff on Canadian crude could disrupt Midwestern refineries that rely heavily on cross-border flows with few short-term alternatives. Additionally, the White House closed the de minimis loophole that had exempted small packages under $800 in value from tariffs. American consumers who shop online for low-cost goods from Canada, Mexico, or China are likely to feel the pinch as these purchases become subject to the tariff net. Trump's orders also include so-called retaliation clauses, allowing the administration to increase tariffs beyond the initial 25% and 10% if the targeted countries strike back. Canada, Mexico, and China have already signaled they will respond with equivalent or proportional measures, creating uncertainty for industries that rely on stable trade flows and cross-border agreements, like the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Even Europe looms on the horizon. Though not named in the weekend executive orders, The president has regularly cited the European Union's trade surplus with the U.S., particularly in automotive exports. With major economies reacting to Washington's latest moves, the risk of a broader global trade conflict remains palpable. Between 2017 and 2021, the White House deployed tariffs as a key tool in its America First agenda. Initially, these measures contributed to a modest revival in certain manufacturing segments and brought attention to what Trump deemed unfair practices. Over time, however, they also drove up costs for manufacturers dependent on imported inputs like steel and electronics components, provoked retaliatory tariffs on agricultural products that pushed farm incomes down, and forced government bailout packages, introducing significant volatility in financial markets as businesses struggled to forecast future trade policy. While GDP growth remained stable at roughly 2.5% annually in pre-pandemic quarters, business investment showed signs of cooling, partly due to lingering uncertainty over tariff regimes. Economists worry that the far more sweeping nature of the new tariffs, aimed at the three countries accounting for nearly half of all U.S. imports, could spark disruptions on a larger scale. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. If our content resonated with you or sparked inspiration, please consider expressing your support by liking and subscribing to stay connected with our community. Your support holds immense value for us, and you can watch another video from our channel, which is now on the screen.